Hello and welcome to Bread Theory. Tonight we're going to be continuing on with Alexander Berkman's What is Communist Anarchism, also known as the ABC of Anarchism. It's been published under several titles. And tonight we're going to cover the chapter on socialism. So we're going to see what he has to say about the concept of socialism. And of course, he's going to be coming at it from an anarchist perspective. And from what I gather, he is on the more individualist side of anarchy as opposed to collectivists. So this would be interesting to see where he takes this. And as always, if you have any questions or things aren't making sense to you, just throw a question up there in the chat, and I'll do my best to give my take on it at the very least. All right, well, let's get into the chapter. Oops. Okay. And there we go. Just maximize that. And we should be ready. Oh, let me make sure I have closed captioning on as well. I know that helps me when I can read along with what's being said. And just a reminder too, I do have a Patreon now, so if you like this sort of thing and you don't feel like giving your money to Bezos or any of the other big companies by supporting me through one of the streams, or through one of the places that I stream to, you can always head over to Patreon and have just one tier right now. Probably just going to keep it that way, $5 a month. I figure, if you like this sort of thing and you feel like buying me a cup of coffee every month, then I think that's more than a fair trade on as far as I'm concerned. All right, well, let's get into the chapter. Not that one, right here.
This audio production was made in collaboration
As always, we're
with
using Audible
Anarchist.
Anarchist, a really great YouTube site.
Chapter 13. Socialism. When you ask the above question, the socialist tells you, "Vote the socialist ticket, elect our party, we'll abolish capitalism and establish socialism." What does the socialist want? And how does he propose
Already,
to get
I'm
it?
going to have to pause that. So, the form of socialism that he's talking about, or I guess rather the strategy of socialism, is the electoral one. This is what parties such as is the Labour Party in England were originally formed to do to basically vote in candidates that would enact socialism. So far, that strategy has not worked anywhere in the world. There's been countries that have gotten much better versions of capitalism, let's just put it that way, have managed to create a robust enough social safety net that they can smooth over a lot of the harms, or have at the very least come up with a redistributive tax system that is robust enough that a lot of the value that is stolen from workers and in their form of their excess labor value is then redistributed back to them through government means. But still, no country has voted in socialism so far. So it seems like it may be a worthy strategy in terms of, say, harm reduction, in terms of making some progress, but as far as it being a strategy to get us across that goal line to a point where we have an actual leftist form of government, doesn't seem like it works that well, at least not yet. So yeah, let's continue on here.
There are many varieties of socialists. There are social democrats, Fabian socialists, national socialists, Christian socialists.
Ooh, and I would not put the National Socialists in the category of any real sort of socialism. National Socialists, of course, are the sort that they were a wing of the Nazi Party. They were the left wing of the Nazi Party, who wanted, in some respects, a form of socialism in terms of, like, providing for unions and stuff like that, but only for white people. So to say that they bared any resemblance to a true socialism, which starts from the basis that all people are more or less equal, which, in my opinion, to be on the left side, you have to at least agree with that statement. Everyone is pretty much equal. Skills, abilities, all these sorts of characteristics are more or less evenly distributed across socioeconomic strata, across race, across religion, geography, all that stuff. It's pretty well evenly distributed amongst people. So if you don't believe that, if you can't even agree to that premise, I find it hard to agree that you should be associated at all with any sort of leftist ideology. So I would not include the National Socialist in that list there. And Christian Socialist, I don't know exactly what group he's referring to. I've heard of the Fabians. I'm not too familiar with them, but we can look them up later if people are interested.
And other labels. Generally speaking, they all believe in the abolition of poverty and unjust social conditions. But they all
But the
disagree
National
very
Socialists,
much as to
again, the National Socialists do not believe in the abolition of unjust conditions. They want to increase it for their political enemies. So, I'm not finding a lot of usefulness for this distinction so far.
what would be just conditions, and, still more, how to bring them about. These days, even mere attempts to improve capitalism are often called socialism, while in reality they are only reforms. But such reforms cannot be considered socialistic, because true socialism does not mean to improve capitalism, but to abolish it altogether. Socialism teaches that the conditions of labor...
And that's the other thing that those, I keep harping on it, but the National Socialists ultimately didn't have a problem with capitalism either. They at the most wanted some social safety programs or some social well-being programs and strong labor unions for white people. But yeah, to say that they wanted, just doesn't make sense to include them with this group. So I guess I'm going to keep having a problem with the way he's characterizing
labor
this.
cannot be essentially bettered under capitalism. On the
That's where I was going with that. So they don't necessarily want to do away with capitalism either. It's not as though, well, for one thing, all the socialist wing of the Nazi Party was executed before they really got going as rulers of Germany. So there's that. The socialists were the first to be rounded up and executed, and that included the so-called socialists from their own party. But also, under Nazi Germany, it's not as though they did away with capitalism in any way, shape, or form. They basically just used it when they wanted to. It was kind of as Umberto Eco characterizes it. It was the entwinement of state and private interests. And of course, remember that private interest doesn't just mean non-governmental. It means owners of capital. So the owners of the businesses, their interests were intertwined with that of government. Not so different than we have in the U.S. right now. Oftentimes, those two, you'll see these public-private partnerships. You'll see a lot of tax breaks and incentives for businesses, especially certain types of businesses, like ones that are seen as large job creators. You'll see governments put out stuff like that in order to attract business in. So there definitely is some entwinement of private and public interests, which I find worrying. I don't like that. I think it ends up hurting cities in the long run, especially smaller ones that don't have a lot of leverage. If you give a company a tax break, then they're just going to expect it forever. And if you can't really afford it, or you want to put your money elsewhere, then they can always just threaten to leave. So you're putting yourself at a disadvantage to begin with. Doesn't make sense as a good strategy for me.
contrary, it shows that the lot of the worker must steadily get worse with advancing development of industrialization, so that efforts to reform and improve capitalism are directly opposed to socialism and only delay its realization. We have seen in preceding chapters that the enslavement of the workers, inequality, injustice, and other social evils are the result of monopoly and exploitation, and that the system is upheld by the political machine called government. It would therefore serve no purpose to discuss those schools of socialism, improperly so called, that do not stand for the abolition of capitalism and wage slavery. Just as useless it would be for us to go into allegedly socialistic proposals such as juster distribution of wealth, equalization of income, single tax, or other similar plans. These are not socialism, they are only reforms. Mere parlor socialism, such as Fabianism for example, is also of no vital interest to the masses.
Okay, so that confusing way that he organized things at the beginning here, listing the different types of socialism and now striking down ones that are just reformist, which I would agree with. Being a social democrat, which sounds like it's a pretty similar definition to what we have today. These would be like the Bernie Sanders and AOC types. Yeah, not true socialism, but just seeking to smooth over the worst effects of socialism, heal the gap between the capitalists and the workers. So yeah, and I mostly agree that that pursuing these things are not in our best interest because it gets distracted. As he's saying, it kind of distracts from a true socialism. So just fiddling with things like tax rates and redistribution schemes, while it might help, it might be worth pursuing for some. Ultimately, you have to do more. You might have a broad movement, and part of it is focused on that. But overall, if the goal is justice and equality for all, you shouldn't get too tripped up in things like electoralism. They should be seen as secondary to more important things like providing the basics of life for your community, like setting up networks of mutual aid. These things are more important. But that's not to say that you couldn't do both, just in a lessened capacity.
Let us therefore examine that school of socialism which treats capitalism and the wage system fundamentally, which deals with the worker, with the disinherited, and which is known as the social democratic movement. It considers all other forms of socialism impractical and utopian. It calls itself the only sound and scientific theory of true. Socialism, as formulated by Karl Marx, the author of Capital, which is the gospel and guide of all social democrats. Now then, what do the socialist followers of Karl Marx, known as Marxian socialists, and whom, for the sake of brevity, we'll simply call socialists, propose? They say that the workers can never be free and secure well-being unless they abolish capitalism. The sources of production and means of distribution must be taken out of private hands, they teach. That is to
I would
say,
agree.
the land, machinery, mills, factories, mines, railroads, and other public utilities should not be owned privately, because such ownership enslaves the workers as well as mankind in general. Private possession of things, without which humanity cannot exist, must therefore cease. The means of production and distribution.
So, sorry. So what he's saying is basically we have to do away with private property because it is inherently exploitative to the workers, and that's definitely true. I would definitely agree with that formulation there and that prescription. Yeah, I guess that's all I had to say about that. Let's keep on.
Should become public property. Opportunity for free use would do away with monopoly, with interest and profit, with exploitation and wage slavery. Social inequality and injustice would be eliminated, the classes would be abolished, and all men would become free and equal. These views of socialism are also in full accord with the ideas of most anarchists.
Right.
The present
And that's important to keep bringing up. You know, we talked about this a lot when we did State and Revolution, how the end state view of things is very similar between communists and anarchists. We want a society that is ruled from the bottom up. We want a society that that uses as much democracy as is feasible. So at the local level, elect representatives to perhaps the city council, then to the county assembly, and then to the state assembly, so on and so forth, and the national assembly at the top. But that, even as Lenin conceived of it in State and Revolution, these people should be not compensated beyond a workman's wages. That's how Lenin put it, to avoid the lure of corruption. You wouldn't have the Nancy Pelosi's coming in trying to get rich off of her position or their position of power. And then also recallable at any time through a majority vote of the people that elected them, to keep power from becoming entrenched to the point where you can't unseat them. And we see that with our what is basically a bourgeois democracy in the United States, where it's very common for representatives and senators to become entrenched in their power. And you know, there's quite a few that have been serving since the 1970s, Biden being one of them, Pelosi being another who's been around for a while, but they're all over the place, and that makes you vulnerable to corruption. That makes you vulnerable to just not having ideas come through and getting new ideas rotated into the mix, because the same person is there and one person can only contain so many points of view. It's good to change out your representatives regularly for a variety of reasons, to just keep the churn of ideas moving, and to avoid corrupting influence, which the longer you're there, the more that say private interests in the case of the US can be reasonably assured that if they give you a lot of campaign contributions, you're going to be around to come back and scratch their back when the time comes, and vote for issues that are in their best interest. So it avoids those two things. But yeah, anarchists view things pretty similarly, except the key difference is really communists don't want things to be voluntarily associated with. They don't want you to be able to just opt out, or any particular municipality or reason to just be able to opt out. They want things to be more centralized in that respect. So, whereas anarchists want things to be more like voluntary associations. So, your district in your part of your city chooses to work with other representatives from other districts for mutual goals, that sort of thing. And it's all based on the idea of not being coerced into any particular government action or accord. So those are really the basic differences. It's pretty incredible how much people then choose one faction or the other, and then just assume the other is completely stupid or naive or ruthless, or all these sorts of terms start getting thrown around over what is ultimately not that big a difference. Continuing on.
Owners, socialism further teaches, will not give up their possessions without a struggle. All history and past experience prove that. The privileged classes have always held on to their advantages. always opposed every attempt to weaken their power over the masses. Even today, they fight ruthlessly every attempt of labor for betterment. It is therefore certain that in the future, as in the past, the plutocracy will resist if you try to deprive them of their monopolies, special rights, and privileges.
And that's one of the other arguments that communists make, is that you need some sort of strong centralized authority to oppose the strong interests of the former regime of private capital. That if you don't get your stuff together and organize a robust defense against it, you'll be facing subversion from within. The people that used to be the landowners are going to be wanting to retake their privileged position. And then also you weaken yourself to being overtaken by other governments nearby who see that as an opportunity to conquer. And then what's the point of, revolutionary action if it's just going to be, swept away in one fell swoop? And then the anarchists, on the other hand, say that the revolution needs to instead be invested in each of the people. That people who have been liberated and finally have real choice and real stability in their life, because the promises of the revolution have been fulfilled and are continuing to be fulfilled, that these people will just naturally not ever want to go back to being ruled again. So defense against these sorts of threats will just naturally arise, and people and different groups will want to coordinate with one another against these sorts of threats. Again, it's not a huge difference when you really think about it, but for some reason it's a huge source of conflict and backtracking and just leftist infighting altogether.
That resistance will bring about a bitter struggle, a revolution. True socialism is therefore radical and revolutionary. Radical because it goes to the very root of the social trouble. Radix meaning root in Latin.
True.
It does not believe in reforms and makeshifts.
Mm-hmm.
It wants to change things from the very bottom. Revolutionary, not because it wants bloodshed, but because it clearly foresees that revolution is inevitable. It knows that capitalism cannot be changed to socialism without violent struggle between the possessing classes and the dispossessed masses. But if a revolution, you ask, then why do the socialists want me to vote them into office? Is the revolution to be fought there? Your question is to the point. If capitalism is to be abolished by revolution, what...
And see, that's where people who follow Lenin, which I think, let me look up when this book was written again, but I believe this was after the Russian Revolution. So this is, I believe, also after the point where he was living in the Soviet Union. So he should know that not all socialists want to be voted, think that being voted into office is the strategy. Those that follow the more Leninist route believe that a violent overthrow of the current order is the only way that things will change. And you can accomplish that through things like vanguardism, which I'm definitely no expert in, but as I understand it, it's basically the people that know, that are in the know. They form a vanguard party. These are the people that want communist revolution, and they are the leaders in the physical part of the revolution, and then they go about setting things up as a socialist, eventually a communist society, after the current order has been defeated. So the idea that all socialists want a reformist revolution is not true, and I think you should know that. Let me just look it up real quick, just double check, because it's been a while since I've been covering this book, and sometimes I get dates and stuff mixed up. Why am I having so much trouble finding it? Let's keep looking. First published in 1929. So yes, this was long after the Russian Revolution. Long after the Soviets had taken power. And I believe this was at the point when he lived in Soviet Russia. So that's strange that he would conceive of things as all being that way. Hello, Radical Disability. How are you tonight? Good to have you. Helen Keller is the woman. Cool. Yeah, Helen Keller, not as well known as a socialist, but that was definitely a big part of who she was and what she stood for. Um, I wonder, you know what? I wonder if she has any writings that would be in audiobook form that we could find in the public domain. That'd be really cool to cover her stuff sometime. I'll have to look that up sometime. But yeah, so many historical figures, the socialist part of their beliefs has been basically scrubbed from the public consciousness. Same thing happened with George Orwell. Same thing happened with Martin Luther King Jr. You know, our capitalist government likes to omit that sort of thing. Perhaps they believe it's too radical, and they want to kind of sanitize history because they are of the opinion that that's neutral. But it should be pretty evident that there's no such thing as neutrality when it comes to politics. That taking out important details of people's beliefs, of historical figures' beliefs, and things that they worked for and thought is itself a political decision. So the neutral point of view just tends to be synonymous with the status quo. And if the status quo is a capitalist dominated economy and a state apparatus that backs that up, then that's what all the history books are going to tack towards. Helen Keller and Her Socialist Years by Philip S. Foner. She is a hero. Like she is what I call her, the Angela Davis for the disability community. That's really cool. You know, I don't actually know a whole lot about her life. So that'd be cool to look that book up. See if we can find an audiobook version of it at some point. Thanks for the suggestion. All right, let's get back to this chapter.
What do the socialists seek office for? Why do they try to get into government? Here is just where the great contradiction of Marxian socialism comes in. A fundamental contradiction that has been fatal to the socialist movement.
See, but Marx himself, I don't believe, ever advocated for this sort of a revolution, for it to come through the ballot box. He was pretty emphatic that we couldn't just wield the capitalist state power and by doing so turn it into a worker state, that the apparatus had to be broken down completely. We had to break the government down completely and replace it with a form of government that held the worker up as the thing that should be protected, rather than capitalists and their possessions. So I don't think that's a fair characterization.
Every country, and that has made it ineffectual and powerless to be of any use to the working class.
And that is a fair point, that at least those who try the electoral route, as I was saying earlier, they so far have failed at that. The best that they've done is basically the Nordic model. And the Nordic model rests on a lot of imperialism to prop it up. It's just that you don't see the exploitation up front as much. But yeah, without cheap labor and cheap resources from other parts of the world, it would be difficult to prop up the Nordic model as well. Just because capitalism is inherently exploitative. That's just how it operates. So basically, what they've done is they have substituted the exploitation of the workers, or they've taken away a degree of their exploitation, but replaced it with exploitation of third world countries. And also uh, fossil fuels. Countries like Norway depend very heavily on fossil fuels to fuel their economy.
It is very necessary to understand that contradiction clearly in order to understand why socialism has failed.
Oh, I see you're trying to post a link there, Radical Disability. I have it turned off to, I have links turned off in the comments. So if you want to go post a link, the place to do it is the Discord. I'll pull that up for you. So there you go. Should be able to join the Discord there and then put it in the whatever whatever section you feel is most appropriate.
Why socialists have gotten into a blind alley and can't lead the workers to emancipation. What is the contradiction? It is this. Marx taught that revolution is the midwife of capitalism pregnant with a new society. That is, that capitalism will not be changed to socialism except by revolution. But in his Communist Manifesto, on the other hand, Marx insists that the proletariat must get hold of the political machinery of the government in order to conquer the bourgeoisie. The working class, he teaches, must grasp the reins of the state by means of the socialist parties and use the political power to usher in socialism.
Yeah, I don't think he meant, though, just get elected and then we'll do it. I think he also meant that the state apparatus had to be destroyed. I think he recognized pretty well that you can't just operate a system that favors the bourgeoisie at the expense of the worker and hope to get any ultimate result that's different. You can't just reform that. You have to because at its core, it is a bourgeois state. It is a state that supports the private property owners and their property. That's very much baked into the system itself. So I don't think that he himself thought that was the route. I think he saw violent overthrow of the government and replacing it with a different sort of government entirely. A complete remake of what government is or had been up to that point. So, yeah, I think it's a little bit of a mischaracterization by Berkman there.
This contradiction has caused the greatest confusion among socialists and has split the movement into many factions. The majority of them, the regular socialist parties in every country, now stand for the conquest of political power, for the establishment of a socialist government whose business it will be to abolish capitalism and bring about socialism. Judge for yourself if such a thing is possible. In the first place, socialists themselves admit that the possessing classes will not give up their wealth and privileges without a bitter fight, and that it will result in revolution. Again,
like imagine for a second that somehow true socialists swept into power at the federal level in the U.S. and they were going to go ahead and institute their socialist program. What would they actually be doing, though? Right? Would they be putting forth laws that would outlaw private property? Because as long as you're allowing private property, and again, private property meaning the means of production, the property, the physical property, the intellectual property, the machinery and the land that you can use to produce a means of subsistence, unless they were outlawing the private ownership of all of that, and saying, well, now all the workers are going to take over the operations, and they will all collectively own each of their operations, then they're not really going to usher in socialism. It just, it doesn't quite line up that way. We are operating on a capitalist playing field in this political system. I mean, you would you would have to outlaw private property. And maybe if enough people were behind that, then we would all just go along with it, and that actually could be something that could happen, but it doesn't seem too likely, especially when you have things like free speech laws that have been interpreted by the Supreme Court to include donations to political parties. Just that alone allows capitalists to inject their interests to all levels of the political system to such a degree that it seems very unlikely that the capitalist form could ever be voted out. I think at best what they could do is get rid of all the benefits, all the tax loopholes and shelters for private companies, unless they were organized as more of a democratic workers cooperative, and then also institute laws that would promote worker-owned cooperatives to be the dominant form. And then maybe way down the line, as things change and power is slowly taken from the owner class, then maybe. But it's hard to imagine anything like that happening and the big moneyed interest just standing by and allowing it. I mean, we saw a really feeble attempt at it was basically a petty bourgeois insurrection. That was January 6th of last year, where I think the vast majority of people that showed up at the Capitol and attempted to disrupt the democratic process were themselves small business owners. They were the petty bourgeoisie. They were not big influencers. They weren't like captains of industry, but they were more like, the person who owns the boat dealership in a small town, or person who owns maybe a large landlord or something like that. But not the kind of people that could ever influence politics at a national level otherwise. So it seems if we were going to, through democratic means, do away with all of those people's, sole right to the means of production in their respective fields or respective businesses. But not only that, all of, that would basically be a massive takeover of all the financial institutions, all of the, all of the big business at the same time. It's hard to imagine all of those interests just idly sitting by and letting it happen. So that's why it seems like it's not a winning strategy ultimately. So Radical Disability says reform and more reform to socialism does not work, and nonviolent revolution is not going to happen. It is our human nature to be outlandish and vile. Excuse me. We are not the civil creatures we are a part of the animal hierarchy, and we have dominated the biosphere. But I know there is a caveat that as humans, We have special rights that we alone give ourselves above the privileges of the animals. Yeah, that's saying a lot right there. Um, I would agree. Reform is not enough. It will never be enough. It would be like, all the wealthy capitalists are in a yacht and it's speeding up, ever going faster and faster and faster. And the working class is in a, single engine motorboat. And though they might, you know, go faster, they will never accelerate at the speed that the yacht is accelerating away from them. So they will never catch up, and the gap will only continue to get wider and wider. So even though there's, you could say, well, uh, in your motorboat, you're still making progress, you're still getting ahead, and you're still starting to go faster and faster. But it never, you're never going to catch up. You're never going to get to the point where everyone is moving at the same speed, and everyone's, material conditions are more or less the same, and everyone has the same opportunity. You'll never get to that point. The gap will just keep getting wider and wider and wider. So progress is good, but it has to at least be keeping pace with how good things are getting for everyone else, or for the wealthiest class. Yeah, yeah. Reform is just supporting the Democratic Party's mode of capitalism, and make no mistake, the Democrats will never give up capitalism. So that right there is a huge stumbling block to reform, especially in the U.S. Like, you might be able to make a case for more parliamentary systems where there's at least the possibility to have other parties that get together a large enough portion of representation that the larger parties are at least forced to form coalitions with them. But in the U.S., we're basically a two-party system, and all public and private apparatus is set up to keep things that way. So, like, if say the Republican Party just completely ran its course, which it looks like it might be, they've come to the point where they cannot win without structural shenanigans, really, without putting their thumb on the scale and gerrymandering their way to victory, or disenfranchising enough voters that they can still eke out some sort of majority. So they've gotten to that point in this country. I think it hasn't been since Bush Jr. that they have won the presidency with also while also winning the popular vote. So it very well may be that we're coming to the end of the Republican Party. But if it died, another party would just spring up in its place, and it would be just those two parties. It would be like what happened when the Republicans, I think it was the Republicans that took over for the Whigs, or was it the Democrats? I don't remember entirely. But at one point, the Whigs were one of the two dominant parties, and then they faded away in relevance. But just another capitalist party took its place. So that's likely what would happen again. It would just be like, the progressive wing of the Democrats might break away and make their own party, which would be good, which again would be progress, but still operating within the framework of capitalism. So still operating within a framework that allows structural inequality. So it would never quite be enough, never quite get us there. Yeah, the Libertarian Party, and that's another thing. Libertarian Party could fracture away enough of the votes from the Republicans that they become the second party. That's true as well, which would be in many ways, an even further slide backwards for the country if they ever got power, because they don't want any regulation for businesses. It's that muddled worldview that you somehow don't believe in hierarchies or unfair interventions and stuff like that, except for in the case of private industry. There, it's totally fine to have hierarchies. It's totally fine to have unequal negotiations between workers and owners, because it's all about the freedom of the owners, and they all think they're going to be owners, or maybe already are in many cases. So yeah, it's definitely not going to be a step forward if they ever take over for the Republicans. All right, let's keep on with the chapter here.
Is the thing at all practical? Take the United States, for instance. For over 50 years, the socialists have been trying to elect party members to Congress, with the result that after a half a century of political work, they now have just one member in the House of Representatives in Washington. How many centuries
didn't even know
will
they
it
had
take
that
at
many.
that rate, and the rate is declining rather than growing, to get a socialist majority in Congress? But even suppose that the socialists could someday secure that majority. Will they be able to change capitalism to socialism? It would require amending and altering the Constitution of the United States, as well as the
That's the thing.
individual states, for which a two-thirds vote would be necessary.
That's the thing. You would have to convince a vast majority of power holders, so not even vast majority of the people. People are more or less irrelevant in that. It's the state legislatures that have the power in a constitutional convention. But yeah, you would have to hold a constitutional convention that would lead to the end of capitalism. Meaning 2/3 of the state's legislatures would have to be on board with that. Meaning that 2/3 of the state legislatures would actually have to be represented by the people, and not just by business interests, which already structurally, in order to run for, especially for if you're getting up to the state level, if you're going to run for those tickets, you basically have to either be independently wealthy. You have to have a lot of money, or you have to have a business that you can then take time away from, but still get money from. Because it takes a lot of time and it takes a lot of money to run a campaign. It's a full-time job, so you have to have something to fall back on. So that pretty much excludes anyone that depends on a 9 to 5 job, anyone that is a typical worker. So that's a lot of ifs to get to the point where, for whatever reason, that's not the case, and that average people actually can run for office, or at least somehow get capital owners that actually care, that are willing to go against their own class interests and actually do things for workers, get enough of them into offices at state legislatures, and then there have to be 2/3 of the state legislatures. So that would be, that would be what, 30 states. Yeah, 30 states would have to sign on to that. Oh no, 33 states, right? Oh wait, no, it wouldn't be 30. Yeah, 30. That would be 60%. So yeah, around 30 states would have to sign on to that. So that's so many what ifs already that, it really doesn't seem likely. So yeah, I think he's spot on with this part of it. His analysis of reformist socialists is pretty good, I would say. I just don't think it's fair that he lumps all socialists, especially ones that follow Marx, into this, because I don't think they would agree with this strategy as the way to actually affect socialism.
Just stop and consider. The American plutocrats, the trusts, the bourgeoisie, and all the other forces that benefit by capitalism, would they just sit quietly by and permit the changing of the Constitution in such a manner
Exactly.
as to deprive them of their wealth and privileges? Can you believe that? Do you remember what Jay Gould said when he was accused of getting his millions illegally and in defiance of the Constitution? To hell with the Constitution, he replied. And so every plutocrat feels, even
Right.
if he is not as frank as Gould. Constitution or no Constitution, the capitalists would fight to the death for their wealth and privileges. And that is just what is meant by revolution. You can judge for yourself whether capitalism can be abolished by electing socialists to office, or whether socialism can be voted in by the ballot. It is not hard to guess who will win in a fight between ballots and bullets.
That's funny. And yeah, I think even for those of us who are like myself, who see a potential different option in affecting a revolution, one where instead of overthrowing the current system directly, and instead of turning towards electoralism and reformism, we build the apparatus of the government that we want to see, more or less. So we build parallel structures right now to, you could start it on the neighborhood level. Say anyone that's in your neighborhood, you can come to a neighborhood assembly to talk about the issues that are affecting you. And as long as you are a member of the neighborhood, you have the right to speak, maybe even vote on certain issues. And then perhaps each block elects a block captain to serve as their representative, because I mean, even just having one block captain per block in a neighborhood, you're going to be having, I don't know, maybe 300 delegates even at that point, and that's a lot to manage. And then come together under you come together under the common cause of providing a stable platform of basic necessities for everyone in the neighborhood or everyone in the city. Let's just say that, and that you would work with other neighborhood councils, the same sort of council set up in other neighborhoods to coordinate between to meet people's needs. And you could say that you could make your mission statement that people are more or less equal and therefore deserve a stable and adequate platform to stand upon to have an equal chance to reach their highest and best potentials. And that platform should consist of food, housing, healthcare, utilities, transportation, education. Let's see, what am I missing here? Anyway, the basic necessities of life. And then you could, that being your organizing principle, you could set up committees around each of these things. So you'd have a transportation committee, and they would organize mechanics in the neighborhood who could help fix people's cars free of charge, just an act of mutual aid. You could organize ride sharing in order to help get people to and from work so they can obtain the subsistence they need to live. You could get together money to help buy people cars or bicycles. You could collectively lobby the city or whoever the transit authority is for your region to get better mass transit or reduced fares or no fares. It could be basically anything that your transportation committee can think of and put resources and potentially money towards. That'll be what they do. And then you have a different one for education, and you set up free education for members of your neighborhood. You can help tutor people. You can set up an after-school program. You can help people learn the principal languages that are spoken in your neighborhood. Help with a intercultural share of knowledge and understanding. These sorts of things. You can set up committees around all these sorts of things, with the purpose of providing what the current government is not. So we're setting up parallel structures. It's a strategy known as prefiguration, where you're using the relative stability and wealth that has been generated by capitalism to set up structures that actually function for the people, actually give them that platform so that they have agency, democracy, freedom to a much greater degree in their lives. So even if you did that sort of system, though, that's not, you're not going to be guaranteed that at some point when you are more or less locally self-reliant on one another for meeting your basic needs, and the private interests in the area are not as relevant. They can't hold your job over your head and say, get back to work, or else, you're going to stop. They can't have work or starve be a threat anymore. These sorts of things. There's nothing that says that at that point something is going to or some backlash will come, right? And we saw this with, like, when the Black Panthers were doing things like they had a breakfast program for I think it was school children in the neighborhoods that they operated in. They were trying to set up a free clinic for residents who couldn't afford health care. Doing these sorts of things was seen as a direct threat to power by the powers that be. And there's always that possibility that the same would be true. So even if you're not directly threatening the power structure, like, you're not threatening to storm the Capitol, you're not threatening to just completely disregard laws or anything like that. All you're doing is providing where the government is not, and working together where they're trying to keep you individuated and apart. Even though that's all you're doing, you might still be seen as a threat. So you might face violence even still. But as far as I'm concerned, I think that's a more acceptable route, that it also includes violence. Because it's not violence that you're initiating. It's violence that's being imposed upon you when all you're doing is trying to help everyone else and help everyone live a life that is deserved to anyone that is human. So anyway, yeah, enough of that aside. I see a different way than all the methods that he's talking about. But still, the idea that it will be completely just an easy cakewalk and that no one will oppose that sort of a movement violently, in fact, I don't know that that's true. That it would not be opposed that way.
In former days, the socialists realized this very well. They claimed that they meant to use
Council communist, I think that would fit pretty well with my beliefs. I tend to go more towards the anarchist side, just because I'm inherently suspect of any sort of concentration of power. But I'm very much a collectivist. I disagree with the sort of individual anarchy that it seems to me like Berkman and Emma Goldman and Max Stirner and these sorts of figures hold up. I think we have positive duties to one another as human beings. And I think humanity is best when it is working together and not just doing what we each individually feel is right. But yeah, I think council communism is not far off the mark of where I would fall. Pretty much every time I take like a left values test or something like that, that tends to be at the top or near the top. So yeah, I would say that's fair. But yeah, I believe in social organizing at the very local level to start with. I think, and that's also another reason that I tend to, because it does tend to focus on more direct action and more grassroots kind of bottom up organization. Not that I can't appreciate a more top down approach when it is for the purpose of protecting against people that would destroy a communist movement. But yeah, I think that what I laid out basically would be a good way of going about things, especially if it were started in more of an impoverished and oppressed neighborhood. I think you'd have a lot more trouble starting it in a fairly well-to-do suburb or something like that, where homeownership is already high. Because, yeah, I mean, at this point, we do have some capitalist realities that we have to deal with. We have to deal with the fact that under this current system, what is respected most under the law and just in society's eyes is private property, and not just private property, but personal property when it's in the form of, say, a home. So homeowners are always more respected and always given more deference and always have more legal protections than renters. So facing that reality, what do we do about that? Well, if we're talking about setting up a housing committee, something that they could do is collect money to buy up, say, you could start with some of the most impoverished or most low income apartment complexes. Start buying those and giving them to the people that live there. Or cooperatizing them, turning them into a housing cooperative, and one way or another, getting it out of the hands of landlords and giving it over to people, because that, I think more than anything, that will give people security and give people more of a footing to start pushing for other things. I mean, what is the number one expense for most working people? It's going to be housing. What is the thing that is least stable for most working people? Again, it's going to be housing. So if we can at least get that part of the puzzle put together, I think we have a much better chance of starting to tackle all of the other issues as well. So Radical Disability says, what I see is what is stopping this said government from creating a pogrom, right, to these decentralized second governments. That's true. At some point, the government or private interests might see you as a threat to their legitimacy, which you would be. It's just that, I mean, for one thing, legally, I don't see what foot they would have to stand on, because no one is talking about overthrowing any of their seats of power. We're talking about just collectively using our own power together. So legally, they wouldn't. That's not to say that they're not going to try anyway to destroy these sorts of movements. And like I said, that's precisely what they did to the Black Panthers. I think so. For one thing, if you do this sort of a program in your own city, it would have to be intersectional, and it would have to include white people as well. It couldn't just be people of color, because white people can use their shield or their status, I should say, to shield the movement from other white people, to be honest, other people who hold positions of power in government and in the private sector. So I believe in that idea of the Rainbow Coalition, of having people of all races, all sexual orientations, all genders, as intersectional as we possibly can be, coming together. I think that is what is going to make a movement like that, give it the best chance of standing against forces that may seek to destroy it. So you're right. There's nothing that's other than the law stopping governments from doing that. But like I said, if we can get as many people into their own housing, or into homes that they then own, especially if you can get to the point where they're not even paying a mortgage, so they don't even have a bank that can lean on them and cause pressure. If we can get as many people as possible to that point, then the movement is a lot more dug in. It's a lot harder to uproot and still maintain any sort of air of legality or righteousness on the government's part or private interest part. So yeah, I think diversity is our strength, absolutely, in that sort of a case. All right, let's keep on moving on.
Politics only for the purpose of propaganda. It was in the days of when socialist agitation was forbidden, particularly in Germany. If you elect us to the Reichstag, the German parliament, the socialists told the workers then, we'll be able to preach socialism there and educate the people to it.
Oh, see,
There was
again,
some reason in it, because the laws which prohibited socialist speeches did not apply to the Reichstag. So the socialists favored political activity and took part in elections in order to have an opportunity to advocate socialism.
Yeah, I think again he's lumping in National Socialism with a more internationalist style of socialism. So that's not a fair comparison. Because again, for one thing, the National Socialists were all purged from their own party, like killed in like the Night of Long Knives, and were just shipped off to the concentration camps with your regular old socialists and communists and travelers and of course Jews. So that if that's what he's alluding to, that's not a fair comparison, because of course they didn't do what they said because they never wanted the same thing actual socialists want, and because they were murdered. So maybe he's alluding to something else, because there were also socialist parties in Germany at that time, but I don't know.
It may seem a harmless thing, but it proved to be the very undoing of socialism. Because nothing is truer than that the means you use to obtain your object soon themselves become your object. So money, for example, which is only a means to existence, has become the aim of our lives. Similarly, with government, the elder, chosen by the primitive community to attend some village business, becomes the master, the ruler. Just so it happened with the socialists. Little by little, they changed their attitude. Instead of electioneering being merely an educational method, it gradually became their only aim to secure political office, to get elected to legislative bodies and other government positions. The change naturally led the socialists to tone down their revolutionary ardor. It compelled them to soften their criticism of capitalism and government in order to avoid persecution and secure more votes. Today, the main stress of the socialist propaganda is not laid any more on educational value of politics, but on the actual election of socialists to office. The socialist parties do not speak of revolution anymore. They now claim that when they get a majority in Congress or Parliament, they will legislate socialism into being. They will legally and peacefully abolish capitalism. In other words, they have ceased to be revolutionists. They have become reformers who want to change things by law. Let us see then how they've been doing it during the past several decades. In almost every European country, socialists have secured great political power. Some countries now have socialist governments. In others, the socialist parties have a majority. In others, again, socialists occupy the highest positions in the state, such as cabinet officers and even those of prime ministers. Let's examine what they have accomplished for socialism and what they are doing for the workers.
And again, I think he's lumping in democratic socialists with, I'm sorry, I had that backwards. Social democrats with democratic socialism, or democratic socialists, which would be, as I conceive of it, just on the other side of post-capitalism. So these are people that still are I mean, he said it himself. They tone down the rhetoric against capitalism. They make all kinds of bargains in order to maintain power. Yeah, these are not people that are ultimately pushing for any sort of revolution to take place. So yeah.
In Germany, the mother of the socialist movement, the Social Democratic Party holds numerous government offices. Its members are in the municipal.
Yeah, see, again, I wouldn't lump them in with actual socialists. Social democrats, not quite socialists. Social democrats are your AOCs, your squad. It is the most progressive wing of the Democratic Party, for example. People that want robust social programs, maybe even things like Medicare for all and other programs that I would consider more socialist, but are never going to come to the point of saying, and let's also do away with capitalism. So I think there's an important distinction to be made.
Municipal national legislative bodies, in the judiciary, in the cabinet. 2 German presidents, Haas and Ebert, were socialists. The President Reichstangler, Chancellor, Dr. Hermann Müller, is a socialist. Herr Loeb, President of the Reichstag, is also a member of the Socialist Party. Scheidemann Nosk, and scores of others in the highest positions in the government, in the army, in the navy, are all leaders of the powerful German Socialist Democratic Party. What have they done for the proletariat, whose cause the party is supposed to champion? Have they brought about socialism? Have they abolished wage slavery? Have they made the least attempt toward those objectives? The uprising of the workers in Germany in 1918 forced the Kaiser to flee the country, and the reign of the Hohenzollern was at an end. The people put their trust in the Social Democrats and voted them into power. But once secure...
So Radical Disability says, I am not for social democrats. Like that type of shit is ableist as fuck. Like, it's crazy what I saw on the current USA SDUSA. Oh, really? Really? That's unfortunate to hear. That's unfortunate that they are most progressive mainstream party and they're still being ableist in this day and age. That sucks. And that does not bode well for us. Yeah.
Here in the government, the socialists turned against the masses. They combined with the German bourgeoisie and the military clique, and themselves became the bulwark of capitalism and militarism. They not only disarmed the people and suppressed the toiler.
Oh, I'm sorry, someone feels the need to be really loud in the parking lot. So I'm just going to let them settle down. Then we'll continue.
But they even shot and imprisoned every socialist who dared protest against their treachery. Noske, as chief socialist of the army during the revolution, ordered his soldiers out against the workers and massacred them wholesale, the very proletarians who had voted him into power. His own brother socialists. At his hands perished Karl Liebknecht and Rosa Luxemburg, two of the most devoted and loyal revolutionists, cold-bloodedly murdered in Berlin on January 16, 1919, by army officers with the secret connivance of the socialist government.
Just a side note there. I haven't tracked it down yet, but I'm hoping that I can find some work by Rosa Luxemburg. I think that might be the next big communist text that we tackle, if I can find it. So if any of you know of an audiobook version, especially one that's available on, say, YouTube, of any sort of Rosa Luxemburg stuff that we could take a look at, I'd definitely like to know.
The anarchist poet and thinker Gustav Landauer and scores of the best friends of labor shared the same fate all over Germany. Haas, Ebert, Schneidmann, Noske, and their socialist lieutenants did not permit the revolution to accomplish anything vital. The moment they got into power, they used it to crush rebellious labor. The open and stealthy murder of the truly revolutionary elements was but one of the means used by the socialist government to subdue the revolution. Far from introducing any changes for the benefit of workers, the Socialist Party became the most zealous defender of capitalism, preserving all the prerogatives and benefits of the aristocracy and the master class. That is why the German Revolution accomplished nothing except to drive out the Kaiser. The nobility remained in possession of all of its titles, holdings, special rights, and privileges. The military caste retained the power it had under the monarchy. The bourgeoisie has been strengthened, and the financial kings and industrial magnates lorded over the German toiler today with even greater arbitrariness than before. The Socialist Party of Germany, with many million votes behind it, has succeeded in getting into office. The workers slave and suffer as before. The same picture you will find in other countries. In France, the Socialist Party is strongly represented in the government. The Minister of Foreign Affairs...
Oh, okay. Book Club channel. Let's take a look at that. Let's see what you got for us. Oh, cool. On Behalf of the IWW by Helen Keller. It's only a 15-minute book. Wow. We'll look at that. That'll be the very next thing we do then. Right after we get through Alexander Berkman's book, we'll take a look at On Behalf of the IWW by Helen Keller. Been very interested in the IWW and their strategy, because unlike the trade unions for sure, but unlike most unions, they're more about solidarity between all workers rather than representing just one particular group of workers or one particular type of work. So I'm very much interested in them. I have not gotten around to trying to seek out my local chapter or anything yet, but that's on my list of things to do for sure. So the policy positions of the SDUSA. Let's take a look. Social Democrats USA. Okay, it's quite long. Is there anything I should look for in particular? No, not that. What should I look at in particular in this platform? Let's see. Support the American labor movement, support vigorous democracy here in the US and abroad, support the Socialist International, embrace the liberatory potential of religion. At the same time, we're fully committed to the separation of church and state. We oppose totalitarianism in its secular and religious forms. Affirm that in 21st century, the social democratic socialist movement shall also be environmentalist movement. Man, they needed a spelling and grammar check of this. Some proofreading here. Dedicated to preserving the fragile ecology of this planet. Support fair trade. Defend the right of Israel to exist. Oh, why did they put that in the platform? They said the state of Israel is not the product of racism and imperialism. Hard disagree on that one, dog. It is a democratic society. Well, it is a bourgeois democratic society that literally takes land and possessions from Palestinians. But okay. So that's not so great. Unconditional advocates of Israel's right to exist, but are not uncritical and reserve the right to criticize those policies and actions of Israel which we believe to be unjust or unwise. So, like the routine bombing of Palestine, the routine taking of property for settlers. How about that stuff? Not even mentioned. Oh, it's okay. We're looking at the platform of what is this? The Social Democrats USA.
Soft ads.
Yeah, basically.
I think I identified as that for about 5 minutes.
Yeah, so I was okay with their platform until we got to Principle 8. We defend the right of Israel to exist, and that it's very pro-Israel. Israel's great, so democratic. Oh yeah, but we're not gonna be uncritical. So at least they oppose the West Bank settlements expansion policy. That's a big part of what Israel does as a nation. So, and they, okay, so first they said that the labor movement is led by social democrats. It is a democratic society, but it also has a right-wing government in their estimation, which that part I agree with. Oh, and they call it the Jewish state, which theocracy is probably not a great way to go, especially when it's not as though the entire country of Israel is Jewish as well. Two-state solution. Well, I mean, I guess that's better. Palestine should be its own recognized nation. Reject the ideologies of oppression, chauvinism, and racism are obstacles. Let's see. Yeah, central organizers in the 1963 March on Washington for Jobs and Justice. Yet even today, hatred based on sex, race, religion, religious confession, ethnicity, and lifestyle flourish inside socialist parties and the left in general. There's no place inside the socialist movements for such ideologies. We include among these ideologies of oppression anti-Zionism. And it appears as though they are conflating that with anti-Semitism. But those are not the same at all. Zionism is the push for colonialism. So that's a bad conflation. That's a bad look. General work within the two-party system in the United States. Okay. So principle 10 is what you have a problem with. The bottom and the rejection of the ideologies of oppression. Let's take a look again. So 10. So anti-Semitism denies that Jews are human beings. Well, that's true. That's not the same as anti-Zionism. With all the rights of human beings, anti-Zionism denies that Jews are a nation. Jews are not a nation. You see, again, you're conflating a religious ideology with a political state. And those are not the same thing either. Not every Israeli is Jewish. Not every Jew is Israeli, of course. These things don't have to. These things are not mutually. These things are mutually. Well, not necessarily mutually exclusive, but they don't necessarily go together either. We are deeply concerned by the rise of anti-Semitism within the socialist parties and the wider left. We favor an aggressive and spirited campaign to drive anti-Semitism from our ranks. So sounds like basically don't criticize Israel except for about their West Bank settlement program. Is that the issue that you have a problem with, or is it because they did not specifically say ableism? Because they should say that too. That definitely should be a part of any intersectional movement, is to uphold a stance against ableism, uphold disability rights. Yeah. So I agree with a large chunk of that platform. I think they're naive to believe that they can do this through electoralism within the two-party system. I think they can make progress, but you're never going to get to the point that they envision. You know, they have incremental change as their visionary goal. Yeah. Yeah, you're right. I mean, Americans with Disabilities Act passed in the 1970s, I believe. The idea that it would not be included in any leftist platform at this point is pretty ridiculous. Oh, it was 1990s. My mistake. But still, that's 30 years ago now. Should be pretty second nature to have that as part of your platform, to include a stance against ableism. They also didn't include gender, so there's that too. They said sex, but they didn't say gender. Religious confession, ethnicity, lifestyle. I guess that's just their catch-all. But I mean, yeah, definitely should include hatred based on ability as well. Mm-mm-mm. Yeah. Lifestyle is a pretty poor catch-all. That does not include gender. That does not include ability or disability. There's a lot of stuff that's not captured in that supposed catch-all. So, disappointing, for sure. All right, that was a cool aside, but let's get back. I'll link put a link to what we were just talking about there in the chat, so everyone can take a look for themselves. That's the platform of Social Democrats USA. So you say you disagree with them 1,000% that they support Palestine. So you're saying that their supposed support of Palestine is not so. Is that what you're trying to say? Because that's what I got from that too. That's they seem to only have pretty tacit support for Palestine, but they went on for paragraphs about the right of Israel to exist and how Israel is the Jewish state, which it's not. Israel and Jews are separable. Even within the legislature, it's not. I mean, let's look at the breakdown of the legislature. Let's look at going on another tangent here, but actually may not have time. I should rein myself in here. We don't really have time for that tangent. I only have 15 minutes left. In fact, I'm not going to finish this chapter. So let's make as much progress as we can, but we're not going to finish it tonight. It is a longer chapter too. Not surprisingly. We'll take a look though at some more of those ideas another time.
Aristide Briand, who has also held the post of Prime Minister, was formerly one of the greatest lights of the party in France. Today is the strongest champion of capitalism and militarism. Many of his former socialists are his colleagues in government, and many more present-day socialists are in the French Parliament and in other important offices. What are they doing for socialism? What are they doing for the workers? They are helping defend and stabilize the capitalistic regime of France. They are busy passing laws increasing the taxes so high that the government officials may get better salaries. They are engaged in collecting the war indemnity from Germany, whose workers, just as their French brothers, have to bleed for it. They are working hard to educate France, particularly her school children, to hate the German people. They are aiding to build more warships and military airplanes for the next war, which they themselves are preparing by cultivating the spirit of jingoism and vengeance against their neighbor countries. The new law mobilizing every adult man and woman of France in case of war was introduced by the prominent socialist Paul Boncourt and passed with the aid of the socialist members of the Chamber of Deputies. In Austria and Belgium, in Sweden and Norway, in Holland and Denmark, in Czechoslovakia, and in most other European lands, the socialists have risen to power, in some cases entirely so, in other cases partly. And everywhere, without a single exception, they have followed the same course. Everywhere they have forsworn their ideals, have duped the masses, and turned the political elevation to their own profit and glory. These men who rose to power on the backs of labor and then betrayed the workers are scoundrels, I hear you say with just indignation. True, but that is not all. There is a deeper reason for this constant and regular betrayal, a greater and more significant cause for this almost universal phenomenon. Socialists are not essentially different from other men. They are human, just as you and I. And no man turns scoundrel or traitor overnight. It is power which corrupts. The consciousness that you possess power itself is the worst poison that corrodes the finest metal of man. The filth and contamination of politics everywhere sufficiently prove that. Moreover, even with the best intentions, socialists in legislative bodies or in government positions find themselves entirely powerless to accomplish anything of a socialistic nature, anything of benefit to the workers. For politics is not a means to better the conditions of labor. It never was and never can be.
Under a bourgeois democracy. I will agree with that. Yeah, he's got a good point there. Power does corrupt. And that is another reason that I do tend myself towards anarchist tendencies, because the main focus of anarchy is to spread powers as far and wide as possible so that there's just not the opportunity for any one person to wield power over everyone else's heads. So I can definitely see that point. And for sure, you know, even when you have people with good intentions going into the government, people that we even like, you know, like I like Bernie Sanders. I'm wearing him on my shirt right now. But he is hampered in what he can accomplish. Even if everyone in Congress was a Bernie Sanders, they could accomplish a lot of cool things, but socialism never could get to that point. They are structurally prevented from making the changes that they want to see, because we live in as Berkman himself just mentioned, we live in a government that props up private property and private property owners. That's what it comes down to. It's not about the betterment. It's not oriented in a way. At its core, it is not about bettering the conditions of the worker. That may happen sometimes, but that's in spite of the way that it is oriented. It's not because of it. So yes, people get into politics, people get into positions of power, and especially in a society that very much rewards people in positions of power. Again, I'll bring it back to Nancy Pelosi and stock trading as one small but insidious example. It's going to tend to corrupt you if you go into that field. So there's that playing against real change. And then there's the just the structural inability to make the changes that you seek. So he's right about that. He's right about his assessment of the social democratic strategy for ever achieving socialism. I just don't see it as being possible through the current levers of power and the way that they are set up. I mean, at the very least, you'd have, say we got a democratic socialist as a or a social democrat as a president. They would be hampered by the other branches of government. And at the very least, the Supreme Court is going to strike down a lot of the stuff that, even if you had a socialist president, and the same was true of the majority in the House and Senate, then you have the Supreme Court that's going to strike a lot of stuff down that they're trying to pass as being unconstitutional. So you can never really get there. You can never really get there by that strategy. That's not to say that, again, I'd like to emphasize, though, too, that's not to say that there's never a good strategy in voting, and there's never a reason to want to have one person over another, because the people that you least want to have the reins of power also might get that power. So it's hard to argue that it's not at least better if at least more well-meaning and more politically close to yourself get power. That's definitely a good thing, but that just can't be the end all be all of how we interact with politics and how we live our political life.
The demoralization
Just a few more minutes
and
here, we'll go.
vitiation
Then we'll
take
call
place
it
little by
a night.
little, so gradually that one hardly notices it himself. Just visualize for a moment the condition of a socialist elected to Congress, for instance.
Oh, he's going to go through
is
the
all
same
alone.
thought experiment too.
As against several hundred men of other political parties. He senses their opposition to his radical ideas, and he finds himself in a strange and unfriendly atmosphere. But there he is, and he must participate in the business that is being transacted. Most of that business, the bills brought in, the laws proposed, is entirely foreign to him. It has no bearing whatever on the things that the socialist believes in, no connection with interests of the working class voters who elected him. It is just the routine of legislation. It is only when a bill comes up bearing upon labor or on the industrial and economic situation comes up that our socialist can take part in the proceedings. He does, and he is ignored or laughed at for his impractical ideas on the matter, for they are indeed impractical, even at best, when the proposed law is not specifically designed to grant new privileges to monopoly. It deals with matters involved in capitalist business, with some commercial treaty or agreement between one government and another. But he, the socialist, was elected on a socialist ticket, and it is his business to abolish the capitalistic government, to do away with the system of commerce and profit altogether. So how can he speak practically on the submitted bills? Of course, he becomes the butt of ridicule of his colleagues, and soon begins to see how stupid and useless his presence is in the halls of legislation. That is why some of the best men of the Socialist Party in Germany turned against political action, as did John Most, for instance. But there are few persons of such honesty and courage. As a rule, the socialist remains in his position, and every day he is compelled to realize more and more what a senseless role he is playing. he comes to feel that he must find some way to take a serious part in the work, express sound opinions in the discussions in order to become a real factor in the proceedings. It is imperative, in order to preserve his own dignity, to compel the respect of his colleagues, and also to show his constituents that they did not elect a mere dummy. So he begins to acquaint himself with the routine. He studies river dredging and coast improvement, reads up on appropriations, examines the 101 bills which come up for consideration, and when he occasionally gets the floor, which is not very often, he tries to explain the proposed legislation from the socialist standpoint, as he is duty-bound to do. He makes a socialist speech. He dwells on the sufferings of the workers and the crimes of wage slavery. He informs his colleagues that capitalism is an evil, that the rich must be abolished, and the whole system done away with. He finishes his peroration and sits down. The politicians exchange glances, smile and joke, and the assembly goes over the business at hand. Our socialist perceives that he is regarded as a laughingstock. His colleagues are getting tired of his hot air, and he finds more and more difficulty in securing the floor. He is often called to order and must be told to speak to the point, but he knows that neither by his talk nor by his vote can he influence the proceedings by the slightest degree. His speeches don't even reach the public. They are buried in the congressional record, which no one reads, and he is painfully aware of being a solitary and unheeded voice in the wilderness of political machinations. He appeals to the voters.
And that's very much what we see by, members of the Squad. Let's take them, for example. A very small group of progressives who they make impassioned speeches that sometimes get coverage, but more or less they are restricted even by their own party from doing anything that would really change anything. So yeah, we have a pretty good example of what he's talking about right now. Like, they may have some good ideas that would help a lot of people, but they alone are pretty small as compared to the entire legislative body. So they are prevented from making the change that is needed. And are often just, like you said, held up as a laughingstock, as, strange, pie in the sky idealists that aren't really worthy of serious political consideration.
To elect more comrades to the legislative bodies. A lone socialist cannot accomplish anything, he tells them. Years passed, and at last the Socialist Party succeeds in having a number of its members elected. Each of them goes through the same experience as their first colleague. But now they quickly come to the conclusion that preaching socialist doctrines to the politicians is worse than useless. They decide to participate in the legislation. They must show that they are not just spouting revolution, but that they are practical men, statesmen, that they are doing something for their constituency, looking after its interests. In this manner, the situation compels them to take a practical part in the proceedings, to talk lousiness, to fall in line with the matters that actually dealt with the legislative body. Full well they know that these things have no relation to socialism or to the abolition of capitalism. On the contrary, all this lawmaking and political mummery only strengthens the hold of the masters upon the people. Worse, it misleads the workers into believing that the legislatures may do something for them, and deludes them with false hopes that they may get results by politics. In this way, it keeps them looking to the law and government to change things, to improve their condition. So the machinery of government carries on its work. The masters remain secure in their position, and the workers are held off with promises of action by their representatives in the legislative bodies. By new law.
Doesn't that hit home too? Every election cycle, it's, this time we really got to just vote in the right people, and then we can really, get some good stuff done. And, oh, and this time, if we just get enough of the Democrats in, we can really make some real change here. Uh, and then of course that ends up happening like it did under Obama, where they had even a supermajority. And hey, what do you know? They're deadlocked by their own party. Uh, it's always promises down the road. Oh, just next time, and that's always the way that they uh, prevent people from, or they shame people into voting for them as well. They're like, oh, this election, this is too important to vote for any sort of third party. You might as well just vote for us so that we can keep. There's obviously an evil person on the other side, so we got to keep them at bay. So what other option do you really have? You got to vote for us. Don't be a spoiler. That sort of thing. It's just constant, and it's never-ending promises that never really materialize. I mean, look at Joe Biden and everything he promised in his campaign. What of those things has he accomplished? He got us part of a check, part of the amount that he had promised, because part of it had come before, so didn't need to give us as much. What else is he? What else? What else has there been? Excuses, lots of excuses. Lots of, well, only if only the right people were in place in this place or that place. Well, then we'd really get stuff done. Or, oh, if it wasn't for the parliament, that pesky parliamentarian, that same parliamentarian that the Republicans have fired every time that they were inconvenient. But no, it's their fault. They didn't want to. They didn't think this was a viable piece of legislation. So we're not going to pursue it. Yep. I see. I definitely sympathize with people that just get completely disillusioned with electoral politics because of the circus that always takes place. The sleight of hand, the lots of big shows of things without actually accomplishing anything. But yeah.
Laws that give them relief. For years, this process has been going on in all the countries of Europe. The socialist parties have succeeded in electing many of their members to various legislative and government positions. Spending years in that atmosphere, enjoying good jobs and pay, the elected socialists have themselves become part and parcel of the political machinery. They have come to feel that it is no use waiting for the socialist revolution to abolish capitalism. It is more practical to work for some betterment, to try to get a socialist majority in the government. For when they have a majority, there will be no need for revolution, they now say. Slowly by degrees, the socialist change has taken place. With growing success in elections and securing political power, they turn more conservative and content with existing conditions. Removed from the life of suffering and the working class, living in an atmosphere of the bourgeoisie, of affluence and influence, they have become what they call practical. Seeing at first hand the political machinery at work, knowing its debauchery and corruption, they have realized that there is no hope for socialism in the swamp of deceit, bribery, and corruption. But few, very few socialists find the courage to enlighten the workers about the hopelessness of politics to aid the cause of labor. Such a confession would mean an end to their political career, with its emoluments and advantages. So the great majority of them are content to keep their own counsel and let well enough alone. Power and position have gradually stifled their conscience, and they have not the strength and honesty to swim against the current.
All right, let's leave it there for tonight. Yeah, some sad realities that I think are more or less true. We're not going to get to a socialist state just by electing the right people, putting the right people in place, and then just hoping they'll do the right thing. There's too much of a lure, as Berkman kept pointing out. There's too much of a lure of corruption, because you do get a lot of advantages with these positions of power, and the entire state apparatus is set up against it, and the capitalist class wouldn't stand for that sort of revolution. Well, they're not going to stand for any revolution, but and I mean that's another reason that I favor the strategy that I mentioned earlier, the idea of setting up neighborhood councils to slowly draw away the power from the capitalist class. Because I think if you do it slowly enough, or in a way that is not direct but very much effective for the people that are participating in the process, I think there's less they can do about it. Because I mean, of course, it's important to remember that as powerful as the capitalist class is, they are completely dependent on the workers. No doubt about it. All value comes from workers. That's a pretty well-founded truth that came out of Marxism. So without so in the sort of system that I'm talking about, this prefigurative system of setting up alternative structures to take the place of governments, by doing that, you are setting people up to be less and less dependent on any sort of big and powerful institution. If we're more or less dependent on each other to meet as many of our basic needs as possible, without the intervention of business, without the intervention, or without the intervention of completely private business, I should say, and without the intervention of government, then we're taking their power away at the same time as we're empowering ourselves. And furthermore, we are setting up many, many more people to then actually be in positions of power, or positions to take governmental reins of power. So imagine an entire neighborhood manages to handle enough of its own affairs that people don't have to be as reliant on jobs to get the things that they need to survive. Now you have an entire neighborhood of still working class people that have the ability to make decisions in their lives, including the decision to run for local office. And now you can start putting people in positions of local power, who actually, stand a chance to not be corrupted as much because, their needs are provided for. And having gone through the process of empowerment, see the benefit of keeping that on going. But then also, I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought. But basically, you're empowering a lot of people to be able to take up those positions. So you're even further weakening the ability of the powers that be to fight back against you and destroy your movement. And if you took over an entire city government in this method, just neighborhood by neighborhood, just people liberating each other, more or less, you could get to the point where you could start doing things like defunding the police, putting in different government institutions to take care of, wellness checks, traffic stops, any number of things, like the 96% of things that, and I mean that literally 96% of the things that police officers routinely do that should not involve a gun. Only 4% of things that police deal with have anything to do, and this is including paperwork, have anything to do with violent crime. Everything else is non-violent offenses and wellness checks and other sorts of things that are completely inappropriate for police to do. So if you took over an entire large city's government by liberating yourselves neighborhood by neighborhood and having enough people in positions where they could run for these seats, and then also at the same time, because so much of maintaining the status quo through electoralism depends on people being too busy to vote, you know, because they're just scraping by on their 2 minimum wage jobs they have to put together to just survive, and they have to worry about finances constantly. If we're taking away those threats to people, a lot more people could then vote as well, and you have huge voting blocks that you could muster to put people in all levels of government. And if you took over an entire city this way, like I said, you can start doing these things like defunding the police, providing housing for people, just giving them government housing that they, the only thing they might have to pay for is a property maintenance company, and that could be something that is worked out through the city. You could institute better systems of mass transit at that point. You'd have enough leverage to influence entire systems of mass transit, do away with fares, have better and more regular service, And at that point, what are the private interests going to do? They can't hold the jobs above your heads at that point, because you all have come to rely on one another. They can't lean on government to institute laws to strike you down. They can't rely on the police anymore to keep the rabble in line. What really do they have left that they can do, other than outright just start, using illegal and violent force against you, which maybe is what they would do. I don't know. But anyway. All right. I'm going to have to wrap it up for tonight because I've gone past my time anyway. Thank you all for joining me. We'll pick this up again, I think, next Wednesday. Monday I'll be doing another permaculture thing, and Sunday I'm not sure exactly what the topic's going to be, but if you have anything you'd like me to cover, you can always put it up in the Discord as a suggestion. We're going to go ahead and raid into someone now. Let's see who's on. Oh, touring news. Let's do touring news because they were nice enough to raid the other day. So let's get them back on that. If you're finding this from somewhere other than Twitch and you want to check out some cool leftist Twitch streamers, here's another one to check out. That's touring news. And we'll start the raid presently. All right. Thank you all, and I'll see you next time.